this, so it's good to be here. My name is Kelly Norris. I'm a planting designer and plantsman from Des Moines, Iowa. I have was born a plant geek, but to spend the last decade of my life thereabouts, ending in 2020, as the Director of Horticulture and Education at the Greater Des Moines Botanical Garden. And like so many of us in 2020, made a decision to do different things, and have now in private practice as a planting designer, working across the country in ecological planting design. And so the talk today about reimagining the perennial palette from, admittedly, the prairie perspective, since that's the part of the world that we have some natural heritage associations with, stems from a couple of things. One, my kind of assessment of the condition of the market at large. Our gardens are, I think, being asked to be wilder and to be looser and more naturally inspired and naturally connected. I think consumers today are beginning to become aware of the fact that our gardens are not separate from the world around us, that we live in one landscape in which we have done many things with. I will note that this is Plant Talk, and there is a handout online that you can go to the website and download a copy of that if you'd like. And Nick will be sending it out afterwards as well, too, in the roundup to the show. So this collection of plants is, I suppose, is predominantly native. I think it's actually 100% native to the Upper Midwest, but you won't hear me necessarily highlighting that so much, because I think if you're in any aspect of retail-facing parts of the industry today, you know that native isn't just a category anymore. It's simply just an attribute. It's nothing that has to be kept on a special bench over here among everything else. It's simply an attribute by which people are gravitated towards maybe an interest in those plants for a number of reasons. This palette changes when I travel around the country and give it, but obviously in prairie states, highlighted in green, there's a good reason to be kind of cognizant of our natural heritage and aware of the context of the world that we're in. Prairie is not just a monolithic thing. It's not the same thing in all places. It's actually quite nuanced, ecologically speaking, and it's one of the reasons I love making gardens in this part of the world. It is my native terroir, but the prairie is a sort of cosmopolitan idea in many respects. It is a grassland system, of course, but we can find a lot of attributes of prairies subtly changing across a pretty vast slice of the country, almost nearly a third of the country, as the map before this illustrated. One of the great things about the tradition of prairie that we often hear about is the resiliency of prairie plants. And as people who are native to the Midwest, we know that there are certainly lusher, cushier parts of the world that we can call home, but we like calling the Midwest home for various reasons, and as do these plants that have the ability, the capacity really, to withstand everything from extreme heat in the summer to extreme cold in the winter. Of course, one of the things that's happening in the context of climate change is that we're sort of pulling those extremes ever farther apart. We're asking plants to be ever more resilient. And you'll hear me use that word probably a lot today, because I use it in place of the word sustainability because it means something more specific. In my view, just about anything is sustainable with the right amount of resources. But it's the question of resources that is the problem and this is most challenging in the future ahead. One thing about this diagram, which you've probably often seen and heard people describe, is that one of the reasons that prairie plants are resilient is because for all the things that are happening above ground, there's all this business happening below ground. And in fact, it's something of a bit of a myth. It is true, in fact, that most prairie plants have deep and extensive root systems, but there's actually very little research that says that they're doing anything with them. Most of the water retention, most of the water uptake is happening still within really the top third of the overall layer of their root mass. It's this sort of one of these kind of strange little artifacts of the data. In fact, it dates back all the way to the early 20th century. Even early botanists like Weaver from the University of Nebraska was very well aware of the fact that while these root systems were quite deep, the vast majority of water uptake was happening here. So it's actually a bit of a mystery as to why prairie plants have all of this below ground root mass. But all the same, it is certainly one element of the conversation as to why these grassland systems prior to human disturbance were such a recently successful part of the ecological landscape. I mentioned that, of course, there is not a prairie talk, but just as a sort of a quick juxtaposition of different kinds of elements of prairie that you can certainly draw plants from to talk about today. There's prairie across the entire spectrum, from wet to dry, and sort of standard mesic prairie. It's kind of the poster child not too wet, not too dry, maybe in a mid-level sort of geologic position, has certainly given rise and inspiration to a whole host of landscape ideas in the last 10 to 25 years or so. You'll see that interpreted in a variety of ways. This is one of my meadows for one of my clients, sort of classically drawn from that kind of mezzo precedent along a very busy street in western Long Island, about 3,000 square feet. You'll find prairies in dry hilltop positions, very almost barren kinds of vegetation that's really sort of thin and not terribly lush in some ways. A precedent that's very useful when imagining making gardens in rather difficult places, like former lots with gravelly, sandy soil, or in cities and urban environments where there's a lot of concrete and these sorts of stressful elements that place a lot of environmental stress on plants, heat in the root zones, lack of water, whatever. A garden, another client of ours in Ames, is sort of drawn from that idea. Natively sandy and gravelly soil on the site, so we adopted, we worked with it, and certainly created a palette of things that are thriving in the green scheme of it. Yes, sir.
How many years?
This is actually 1 year out from planting. Yeah, this is actually just taken a few weeks ago, in fact. Quite pleased with it, actually. It's going along quite nicely. Sand, do a lot of work in sand, actually. I know sand is certainly, because of the glacial history of Wisconsin, something that you find in a lot of places in this state. Love sand, love working in sand. Sand is an incredible medium for growing and plant sand. We actually imported 2,500 square feet of sand into our backyard at home at Three Oaks Gardens, and actually use as a working model. I will take sand any day for the rest of my life or any other soil you give me. And you may think I'm crazy, but the results bear out. The kinds of diversity that you can grow in sand, the kinds of habitat that is created by sand is incredible. It's an amazing place to observe not only a whole host of plant diversity, but an incredible amount of life, generally speaking. Sand is a great habitat. On the other end of the spectrum, we have river bottom floodplain prairies that give us these sort of rich, dense vegetation that we can elaborate into bioswales, for example. It's something we're increasingly called to do in urban environments. This is the kind of essential green infrastructure that our cities need far more of than they have today. We need to make a paradigm shift away from landscapes that are not even actually that pretty, but that are sort of just, at the moment, kind of parsley trimmings around the pot roast. And then instead of creating landscapes that actually are doing something. Increasingly, consumers are asking for these sorts of things. I posted this little case study about this bioswale, which we did last year from the Harkin Institute of Drake. And I posted it. It was the #1 most shared Facebook post that I'd had all year long. 17,000 impressions. People were absolutely fired up about bioswales for some reason, which just completely caught me by surprise. But you see in a lot of suburban developments and new urban developments, you see a lot of cities placing policy restrictions for tax credits and a whole lot of things on these kinds of features that get built into these developments. So they're increasingly going to become an important part of both landscape architecture and landscape design and public space. That all trails back, of course, to our industry because the plants have to come from somewhere. So the nature of where plants are going from those that we produce on the nursery and greenhouse side is certainly changing, and that's part of the context today, of course, of reimagining what the palette of perennials could be. One of the other things to keep in mind on the residential side of things is that most gardens are small. It's something that's seemingly lost on, I think, a lot of people when you pick up any sort of standard shelter magazine. It's easy to think that we all have big gardens somewhere hiding around at home, but of course the reality is that most lots of medium lot size in the U.S. is right around 0.2 acres, and it's held steady at that for really about the last 20 years. This is according to, actually that's according to the 2020 census as well too, but about 8,900 square feet, right at 0.2 acres. And so if you think about what people are doing with that 0.2 acres, and they're maybe leaving a little bit aside for a driveway and a lawn, maybe a place for a kid to kick a ball, a little vegetable garden. There's not a whole lot of space left that people are necessarily affecting by their planting decisions. So it's one of the things that's worth keeping in the back of our mind as we think about what plants people are kind of looking for. I already think that bias exists in our industry today. It's one of the reasons why why we have the phrase green meatballs. It's the plants that fit and look like they're the same shape, row after row after row. You can go see them in the trial garden out here. A great example of what breeding has done is that we've shaped everything to fit the same size rack in the same size space. So there's already kind of a configurable element to our plant palette. That's of course all annuals, but the same is true certainly with perennials. I think we've gone probably too far in that direction, and I think consumers are increasingly reactionary towards that everything kind of looks the same at the garden center. I think it's an opportunity to maybe disrupt and create some other opportunities in what we're selling. If you looked at any point on Google Earth and you dialed in, an average lot, what 2.2 acres look like, that's what 0.2 acres looks like. Now, I love doing this talk to a group of industry professionals because almost everybody who reacted to that, at least in your facial expression, kind of wins because you're all kind of like, oh gosh, like that. And yet I look at that and see sort of a lot of hope because I see this as a lot of job security and that we have a lot of plants to sell in this neighborhood. I think this is in Florida, actually. There are palm trees down through there. It's an iStock image that I've used for years. But I will say that one other thing, positively speaking about that image, is that if you were to spin the dial and jump somewhere else, you could easily find a neighborhood where 0.2 acres was occupied by far less green and far more gray in many parts of the world. So at least the one thing this neighborhood has going for it is that it has some modicum of vegetation, not a lot, and it's certainly been sold by the same company because it seems to be basically the same palette, one right after the other, up and down the street. So it's, these are just sort of the contexts, of course, in which we're working in as people who are selling plants, whether that's to other businesses or whether that's directly to consumers. We have a lot of opportunity, I think, in how we affect the vegetation of the world. I often say when I'm working with public clients and municipalities and things that vegetation is the surface of the lived experience. Nobody walks into a cafe and says how excited they are about the brick color on the wall. No offense to the architects, but if the containers are really nice at the door, they elicit an emotional reaction in people. Vegetation is the surface of what we experience in the built environment, cities, suburbs, wherever. And it's worth remembering that we should do a far better job of making sure that experience is as positive as it can be. It's interesting if you just pick up your favorite sort of channel or stream for reading news lately. There's been quite an interesting shift, I think, in the narrative about how we're talking about front yards and how we're talking about turf in our landscapes. I'm no enemy of turf. I keynoted the Iowa Turfgrass Conference some years ago. I will say that I think the turfgrass industry takes the brunt of a lot of blame when, in fact, most of the problems are from homeowners doing things with chemicals that you and I would have to have a license to be able to use, and applying fertilizer at a rate that is just grossly unnecessary. So I don't think it's as simple as sometimes as the smoking gun would suggest it be. But all that said, I think the issue with turf is that we have entirely too much of it for no reason. It is a sociological phenomenon as to why we have front yards or turf, period. There's no other reason for it whatsoever. It's a fad that caught on and rooted in deeply in American culture, and it is only American cultures, strangely enough. And it dates to really post-World War II. And it has, of course, inklings in Northern Europe in the late 19th century, but for whatever reason, this idea has burrowed into us, and we're defensive about it, and it's a strange sort of circumstance. All things considered. So of course, the first thing I did when I bought my house was rip out the front yard. I could have remodeled the kitchen. I still need to remodel the kitchen 5 years later. But I tore out the entire front yard. And my mother thought I was nuts. She said, why are you gonna make a garden in the front yard? Everybody will see you. I said, that's the idea. I've worked in public horticulture for a decade. That's not what we're here to do. It was a great experiment, a great social conversation. And to my great surprise, I have had nothing but positive reception about what we've done. In fact, we now have enough of a reputation because of the garden having been published now and having places and just being out and about with it. we sort of often notice people driving slowly around the loop, sort of checking out what's going on and occasionally getting honks and waves from people who are clearly finding some appraisal. The neighbor across the street, just outside of the frame, has a front yard on a 45-degree slope where we're kind of midway through a glacially defined head above the Des Moines River. And they mow their yard with a lawnmower on a string. They're that kind of crazy. And I always think that it's funny that in the grand scheme of things, if you put it to a survey, we'd be the crazy ones because we ripped up our yard, but these people can't mow their yard without literally hauling it up on a string because it's so darn steep. Lovely people, clearly not gardeners. In 2020, actually, I was out watering the nursery, which is east of the house, but within eyesight of the street. And he hollers over and he says, what are all these pink and white flowers out here right now? About this time of the year, late May. I said, it's a pensiment. I said, leaf flowers this time of year, late in spring for a couple of weeks. It was really gorgeous because we love looking down on it. Last spring of 21, full year later, about 2 weeks before, he hollers over, this is about mid-May instead of late May, hollers over and he says, "When is penstemon season?" I'll take that. I mean, that is one useless point of data, but it is an immensely powerful story, I think, to show what vegetation can do for people. I mean, I taught him a new word and he remembered it 1 year later. I mean, the emotional response to what that was profound to me. I tell that story every time I show a picture of the front yard because I think it shows, in fact, just how much we need that kind of experience in our landscapes and how often we're not getting it because we're settling for, Carl Forster and Russian sage, planted ad nauseum. 2 great plants for the record, but all things considered, used ad nauseum to really no great effect. So I've spent a lot of my life in the public realm today. I like public horticulture, broadly defined, because it's where we can have the most impact, it's the most eyes on the work, and people can change the way people see things and the way they view the world. I left traditional public horticulture, at least on the institutional side, to work in private practice to be able to influence more places than just the one 7-acre property that I was in charge of for many years. Now our work is really working at a variety of scales, principally in public practice, but we have an increasing body of private clients. Private clients are fun because we get to work with somebody who I think is very enthusiastic and sometimes is very open to very creative ideas and lets us experiment at scale. We work at all sorts of different scales. I love a small project I love little L strips and curb cuts, the kinds of gardens that are done in front of people's houses and helping some neighbors in our neighborhood right now with a few things. I also love working and doing large master plans for acres of seeding at a time, sort of like we did here with a client up in the Twin Cities. We basically took this zone of what was 8 acres of turf around the house and decided to cut that down by 2 1/4 and add in basically a meadow buffer between the expansive woodland and then where the house lot is cut out of. And so how many
years?
That's 5 years. And if you may, I'll take questions at the end just so I keep going. I've got a lot of plans to get through. That's a 5-year project. That photo was just taken earlier this week, actually. The client texted me from his deck because he was that excited about it. Also was not a gardener, had zero interest in plants, was actually married to his previous ex-wife, was a CEO of a large nursery company, and actually he got into gardening after the divorce, which I don't know if that's a big stick to you or not, but he's completely enthusiastic, and in fact, after this project, he redid his entire garden around the little kind of walkout area where they've got their pool in the back, and it looks, he sent the photo today, and I was kind of like, wow, that looks really good, and I was like, I'm actually almost like offended it looks that good. It was like, I feel like you're taking, I'm not going to get a job here before it's all done. I said, you're picking up the cues here. I said, this is good. So it's amazing what happens when people get fired up about these kinds of things. So the other thing I will say that's changing too, and we'll get into the plants here next, is the way in which we bring plants to market. I think in 20 years, the likelihood of finding 1 gallon perennials sold at retail will be quite small. It's not a resource, it just doesn't make sense in terms of resources, in terms of the value of what it delivers to people. What we're increasingly finding, of course, is that smaller is better, particularly when you're trying to plant at scale. The cost savings alone, and going towards something like a deep 50 or a deep 32 kind of configuration where you have a deep plug that has a lot of good root mass that's balanced to the amount of vegetation that you have above the pot. There's really no linkages that need to be made between getting this direct to consumers. It's just that right now the industry says someone has to be in the middle to do it. And so we're the number of companies that are now finding ways to take elements of what was previously just a wholesale supply chain and get those direct to consumers is increasing. And I think to the consumer's benefit, because certainly the trade-offs, even with a markup, compared to what a 1 gallon version of said perennial might be, represents a considerable savings. And it's just a better deal in terms of establishment. Most of the research now shows us, not true of all herbaceous perennials. We know, I've long known this about trees, But for many species of herbaceous perennials, if you plant a deep cell 50 next to a 1 gallon and you come back and you measure their biomass in 12 months, the deep cell 50 is nearly caught up to the 1 gallon, and the 1 gallon isn't really making that much progress after 12 months because it's had to essentially suffer through a loss of root biomass as a result of transplanting. And so we're seeing measurements and data that suggest that this is just a smarter way to go. It allows for also quicker cycles of return too. I think a lot of the plug suppliers, particularly in 2020 and 21 and now in this year, have really figured that out, that there are crops that not all natives work this way. Some need a longer growth runway than others, and it's one of the challenges for why the availability of native plants is what it is, because there's just some things that need long cold stratification periods, and so it's not easy to configure sometimes more than one crop a season. But for plants like sedges and grasses, I mean, I know native plug growers right now that are doing 3 and 4 turns a year right now on those because they're able to cycle them and program them in a way, and that just means more plugs going out the door. I mean, that's just basic kind of, I think, business smarts about that too. And it's great for designers who are constantly eating up product as fast as we seem to be able to get it. We couldn't get it fast enough last year. We stocked more. And we have our own nursery that supports the practice because we're also plants people and propagators, and we can't keep our fingers out of things. And we're also growing things that we often can't get. So we stocked more in inventory this year than we typically would because we were just tired of chasing availability. So we just got greedy in the spring and filled up a nursery, and then went through one of the greatest droughts in the last 5 years. So we've watered it all summer long too, which has been great. But all things considered, onto the plants, enough of the editorializing. So I've kind of broken this up, and if you're fresh into this, the handout's online at just my name, kellydnorris.com/handouts. Full list starting right here with the grass palette. Grasses, of course, again, in the last 25 or 30 years have become kind of bread and butter for a lot of producers because we as consumers, we kind of love them all. I mean, there's big grasses, there's tall grasses, there's white grasses, there's dry grasses. They're just a sort of versatile kind of plant. And I think increasingly, the way I'm talking to people about plants, and I think other designers and things are as well, is just trying to get people to think about planting with a sense of purpose and using plants for the many attributes that they provide your garden beyond just simply a pretty face. Like, plants can do work for you in landscapes. This is the next category is called green mulch. So it's sort of leading to that idea that by creating communities of plants, by creating systems of plants, we can create plantings that are creating significant returns on investment for landscape management costs and these kinds of things. Tall grass prairie palette, big blue stem was one of the big 4 historically. Tall grasses, a lot of breeding work coming out of Brent Horvath just down the road here, across the border in Hebron, Illinois, from Intrinsic Perennial Gardens. Dancing Wind is one that we particularly like. It's been out for a few years now. The nice thing about Brent's work is that they're all selected for colors and intensity of colors that don't just happen in the fall. So these are summer colors as well as fall colors. So everything from reds to purples and blacks. Nice architectural plants, 5 to 6 feet tall. So we've kind of brought them down in height from maybe where big blue stem might traditionally be in a prairie, which could be 9 feet tall. So we're getting down to a nice architectural size. He's got some new ones up. Holy Smoke is out of his series now. Is probably becoming my favorite. I used to say that about Dancing Wind. I have them all. I use them all. I like them all. This is a plantsman talk, so it's like see all of it, this kind of a thing. It's like there's constantly options, but Holy Smoke is just, it's incredible. It looks like that now in our prairie at home. Just planted another 3 dozen of them in a new area we just did. And that fall color just keeps getting better and better and better and better and better. It doesn't seem to stop once the cool nights kind of get going, so they really just kind of glow like that. But big blue stem can be a bit big, as the name goes, for some places, and so we're always kind of looking for that Carl Forster-like replacement. Little blue stem doesn't need any introduction because it's been part of the trade for a very long time. Perennial Plant of the Year 2023 by the Perennial Plant Association. A lot of cultivars out there on the market. I'm heavily biased towards standing innovation these days. Its performance across the country is notable in a way that's hard to argue with respect to other varieties. I've seen it literally looking good in 3/4 of this country, Colorado to New York. It just spans the climatic zones. It is on the taller end of little blue stems. It can get almost 36 to 40 inches tall. but as the name suggests, it stands up. It doesn't lodge, it doesn't flop like so many of them do. Great drought resistant, drought tolerance rather. Great colors both in summer and in fall. It's hard to beat. There are other great varieties out there, don't get me wrong, but I've included one today because it's just really hard to talk too much about the others when there's so many good things going with standing innovation. Now, we got the two sort of obvious things out of the way too. We're always looking at grasses, at C3 grasses, at cool season grasses. Most of the grasses we work with in horticulture are C4, they're warm season grasses, which is great. August and September, those are grasses that are certainly carrying the garden's aesthetic. Sometimes people criticize wilder gardens like this because there's not a whole lot to look at sometimes in the earliest part of the seasons, but that's because we so often haven't used cool season grasses effectively. And so one of the things we're always looking at is how can we get that biomass generated in the planting earlier in the season and sooner so we can have those kinds of vignettes and combinations we're looking at. Porcupine grass, our native Hesperos stipa. One of the only places I can get it is actually Taylor Creek here in Wisconsin. It's not the most difficult thing to grow, but it's just not in demand yet. And this photo is taken in mid-June actually, so that kind of straw-like character has already turned that kind of color because it's a grass that's been growing since April. We'll get to sedges in a minute when we talk about that. Another grass is totally a sleeper. If you like Mexican feather grass or Mexican hair grass, as it sometimes is called, Macella, which isn't hardy, but we use it as an annual sometimes. This is sort of our prairie equivalent of that. It's prairie satin grass. It gets beautiful gold fall color. We actually have it in a container in the front terrace of the house, and it's just like flax in the hair. It's just incredible in October. Very, very soft texture. I don't know of a single native grass that is softer and finer in texture than this is. Prairie satin grass is what it's called too. Do a lot of work in parking lots and tough places for plants to grow. So we like short grasses, things that reseed, things like purple love grass, which you can find growing up along the roadsides in many parts of the country in about a month or so. It is far hardier, obviously, in this part of the world than something like pink muley grass, which is more common in the south, sort of like kind of bubblegum candy, kind of cotton candy sort of pink that happens in parking lots and those kinds of things. It's great to have other textures kind of floating out of them. Very easy from seed, easy to grow. Another cool season grass that we particularly love is like a little miniature version of Carl Forster's June grass. Again, that's flowering in June. So we're getting a nice kind of grassy texture at a time of the year when we typically don't otherwise have a lot of it. So, but obviously the cool season windows these days most often occupied by a discussion about sedges, the genus Carex, which I kind of am lumping with a few other plants into this category, calling green mulch. I used to tell people when I was at the botanical garden, our mulch budget for 7 acres of gardens was $0. We just didn't do it. We just took all that effort and all that money and all that time and just kept planting. I've yet to find anybody in the industry who genuinely, sincerely loves to mulch. And I just, it's just like, just keep planting. That's our studio motto. Just keep planting. Plants will do that if they're done and all things considered. And the effect ends up becoming, I think, not only more interesting and lovely, but frankly quite useful and functional. I mean, there is no wood chipper out in nature that's mulching everything across the face of the planet. It's this kind of horticultural invention in some ways. Let plants do that work for you and direct those resources elsewhere. So a whole palette of sedges. There's literally a sedge for every place. You've stepped on sedges all throughout your life and never even known it. They're everywhere. And they're quite useful. And the other caveat I would say is they actually don't have to be pretty. Like they're not here to be looked at. They're here to be useful. We have to sort of move beyond the idea that the plant only has to be pretty for it to be able to sell or to be able to have value. In fact, plants have enormous values, and we don't look at the nails and the screws in this building, but they're essential to holding it up and its integrity, and that's how we view plants of this category. Carex pennsylvanica, maybe probably the single most available and dominant sedge in the industry, more of a shade sedge than anything, but a great sort of combination with early spring bulbs and emergent foliage. I hate mud-splattered daffodils in April. It's like you plant for this spring color and then they just sit there with their face in the mud after a rain. So it's nice to have a little sort of companion to kind of lift that up a little bit. There's sedges for sun, there's sedges for shade, there's sedges for wet, there's sedges for dry. In the wild, you can find them living in some of the most difficult and extreme places, and then put them in the garden, and they suddenly sort of sunny up into something much prettier and much nicer to have. Deep shade. This is a native here in Wisconsin and farther east. This is white bear sedge. If you've ever grown or heard of plants called rhodias, an Asian ground cover, very wide pleated leaves. That's about the same size of the leaf in this species. It's a huge texture in the shade, all things considered. Wet spaces, we're always trying to find coarse sedges for things like bioswales, detention basins, and these sorts of things. Gray sedge, a selection called New Moon Mighty, sort of looks like a Sputnik, or as people have taken the saying today, like a coronavirus, sort of head on the end of it, which lasts all through the season, actually even all through the winter. It's an amazing amount of texture that holds in the garden. There's a variegated form that's now available too, which is quite showy, quite sort of luminescent in the grand scheme of things. But this category isn't just about sort of grassy things that are low to the ground. There are plenty of plants doing quite a lot of work in that ground covering understory role, things like our native white wood aster, which is just starting to flower and flowers now and through September, which is great because it's the kind of boring time of the year in most shade gardens. Beyond texture, there's not a lot of flowering, not a lot going on to see, so it's a good asset for those kinds of things. Opposite end of the spectrum, in the spring, plants like Pachyra, which is sort of like searing yellow flowers. Great reseeders sort of fill the gaps between things. There's a million different Pachyras. They're all yellow for that matter. So functionally, they kind of do the same thing, but just a great jolt of color early in the spring. Prunellas used to be an old seed crop. We saw a lot in the early days of perennials in the horticulture industry in this country in the 80s. They've long remained popular in Europe, and they're starting to make a comeback in the US. Many of these selections bloom constantly all summer long. You've actually mowed these in a lawn and not even realized it probably, because they are that common all over the world. Great plants for bees, actually. Most of our small native bees are the #1 kind of pollinator of these. But the flowers aren't all small. There's new selections where the flowers get quite large. In fact, that is not grandiflora mix, I'm sorry. It's a cultivar called Magdalena. We have it in a client's garden, and it reliably blooms for almost 6 months. It starts in April and is still blooming in frost in October. If it gets really, really, really hot, it'll take a little break in the middle of July, and then it just sort of keeps on going again, which is a nice thing to do. This particular selection, Magdalena, is from brand Trinity. The others are otherwise available seed strain that you can get from seeds for the most part. Heucheras, it's hard not to talk about heucheras because they have become a whole category in themselves in the last 20 years. I would say probably most of us treat them like annuals anymore for the most part, because the handful of them, particularly in cold places like Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa, that really actually persist for many seasons is quite small. On that small list, though, should be the Northern Exposure series from Terra Nova. This is from breeding that utilizes our native prairie Heuchera richardsonii, which is hardy as zone 3. And not only now do we have all the colors, but we have the vigor and we have the hardiness in this series. We've grown them all now, and it's the only heucheras we use if we use heucheras in the landscape. The whole spectrum, Northern Exposure, Amber, Northern Exposure, Sienna is probably our favorite. It's the more kind of, the colors are great, don't get me wrong, but in the sort of design work that we do, sometimes that loud color can be just a little too obnoxious, and it's nice to have something that's maybe a little more natural. And so the sienna color does that, although in the spring, actually, it gets sort of very faint kind of yellow shred markings. This is in the Colorado State Trials of Fort Collins and other sort of forlorn places where plants sometimes, but another great one. We've got silver, we've got black, we've got red, but look for that Northern Exposure series from Terra Nova. They are hands down 2 thumbs up on cold hardiness and durability. They're very, very, very good. So we're pleased to finally have one we can kind of consistently recommend. One of the other things about maybe it's my own personal style, but I think in naturalistic sorts of landscapes, we love finding those kinds of airy, hazy kinds of flowers that kind of create, sort of a diaphanous, cloudy kind of look to the garden. Plants like, which we've shown here, A smooth mountain mint, which is one of the candidates for future perennial plant of the year. Is probably, you will never find a plant that has more pollinator sort of attractiveness than this. You can have an entire entomology class in your garden just based on one patch. It's incredible. I'm married to an entomologist, so that's a whole nother kind of thing. But we love watching the huge amount of diversity that these plants attract. Flies, bees, wasps, the whole sorts of thing. Very tough clay soils. It can take about anything. Actually, the tougher the soil, the better, because it will slow down the growth of the plant. They can be a bit aggressive in a very rich garden. So it's nice to kind of hold them off like that too. The other thing I kind of love about these finer textures and these kinds of sort of dusty, hazy kinds of looks is that it creates a little sense of magic, a little sense of mystery. It's fun to watch them on the wind when you live in a windy part of the world like we do. Probably us even more so than you. It's nice to sort of just see that a little bit in the garden instead of only feel it beating against your face at a certain time of the year. And sort of let the place kind of convey itself into the span of the garden. The kind of principal grass that's seen here is same one that we used in the client's garden. This is again back in Ames. If you were here for the beginning of the talk, I showed from this garden. This is a selection from a brand called Honeycomb. If you've grown Blonde Ambition, which is another good variety of Bodalua, but Blonde Ambition has turned out to have, it's not the longest lived grass, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. It's not really hardiness outright, but at any rate, Honeycomb is a little tougher selection for Midwestern gardens. It's from a Midwestern eco-type, and so it does quite a lot better. That's a 1-year-old planting, by the way, from this garden up in Ames, and so you can plant it as 1 gallon for the summer. Actually, I'm sorry, they were quartz, the deep quartz in the fall before, and you really see they have quite a lot of vigor and fill out and create that kind of hazy sort of approach through the path along the garden there too. And maybe one of the classic sort of plants in this category is what commonly gets called redneck baby's breath sometimes, which is a technical name. But Euphorbia correlata, one of our great prairie natives, and it's flowering right now, even when the rest of the garden feels a little parched and a little dry as it's been this year. This plant is sort of just carrying itself through. Fairly easy from seed. It's not, and actually once it's established in the garden, it does reseed politely, not aggressively, so it's nice to have around and kind of just let it sort of travel and find its way between things. These images were taken at the Lurie Garden in Chicago, where they have had it now for a number of years too. Hard to have a conversation about new perennials and good perennials to watch for without talking about plants in the aster family, and especially in this part of the world where we have a kind of global center of diversity for the aster family. Kind of classically prairie plants, all things considered, great for pollinators, kind of universally. It's one of the top herbaceous plant families as far as floral resources go. So they kind of get their own category here. We can talk about coneflowers all day long. There's 1 million of them now in the marketplace, and about every sort of shape, size, or color that you could want. That sort of happens as a result of this species, which started showing up in breeding programs about 20 years ago. That is the one exception. The rest of the genus is pink or white, and this is one species from the Ozarks. It's yellow, and it kind of changed the whole coneflower conversation and opened up all of these shades of colors now that we've become quite obsessed with. Our native pale purple coneflower, its raw natural condition, is a really great plant, a very tough plant, probably the longest lived echinacea in the genus. There's only 9 species in the genus, and most of them are not what we would call true perennials in the sense that they're likely to only live for 3 to 5 years, but they reseed a lot, so that's why purple coneflower has been in our gardens forever, because it just keeps going, just keeps kind of reseeding, but individual plants don't actually live that long. That's not the case in pallida. The Echinacea pallida plants, individual plants can live for well over a decade, and they reseed as well too, so they're great to have in gardens. We've got a few forms of it that you can find in the trade today. One that came from Toledo in Germany is a selection of our native. It's called Hula Dancer. It is a pure white form. It is also the earliest flowering pallida. It beats the rest of the lot by about 2 weeks. So it's this was taken just in our garden on the 1st of June. It's full out. And it lasts so long. I like white as a sort of, effect. I'm not keen necessarily on a garden full of white because I'm a colorful guy and I like color. And so I had always kind of held this particular selection at arm's length until a few years ago. And I have to tell you, it looked like that for 6 weeks in the garden because it's white. I mean, what color is there to fade? It just sits there and holds it for weeks and weeks and weeks. So we're quite pleased with it, actually. We're going to use it a lot more. That effect is, and it's right around the corner of the house, right on the path. So when people come along, it's kind of like, wow, and it's kind of just there all the time. So a nice coneflower to have around in the early part of the season. You know, people always ask me about coneflowers because they're like, what are your favorites? What are the best performing ones? And it's getting increasingly harder to say. But I will say, in the long run, my bet is always going to be on the seed strains. I love Terra Nova. Dan Himes is one of my mentors, and I love him, and I love the company, and I love their work. I think in the long run, though, the best payoff for the landscape and for production is always going to be in the seed strains. That's what the plants want to do. They're inherently short-lived and inherently produce lots of seed. So plants that, it's like, why are we trying to sort of fight kind of what is clearly the kind of natural tendency of that plant to simply live for a little bit, set a lot of seed, get out and keep going. So I'm always kind of biased towards the seed strains these days, particularly from a landscape performance standpoint. They also hybridize. So even if I do use a clonal cultivar, I'm totally content. I have to be content knowing that it's not going to stay by itself. It's going to inevitably kind of leak some of those color genes out into the rest of the population, which in itself can be quite surprising, quite fun. The seed strain that's fairly new to the market, again from Gelito, is called Green Twister. It has those kinds of green fluted petals that kind of come out. It's sort of a novelty. It has varying degrees of consistency. There are now clonal varieties that have taken that trait one in a different direction, but something kind of different, sort of interesting. Heliopsis, dime a dozen, stable perennial for decades, pretty much gold, not a lot of color variation out there, tend to be kind of aggressive and a bit seedy and weedy. All of a sudden now we're getting some attention from breeders to address both of those things, not only just their weediness, but the color range that's available. I'm really loving this selection called Bleeding Hearts, which comes out of these kinds, and it's a seed strain, so it's variable, but tends to come out in the kind of orangey gold spectrum, and then kind of ages to a softer color, has a purple tint to the foliage as well too. Just banana, goes totally bananas this time of year. It's really fun. That's in the Bailey test garden last fall, actually, pretty good. Whole section here on Rudbeckias. I can't believe I'm excited about Rudbeckias in a way that I never thought I would be. But there's been a lot of improvements in Rudbeckias. Out with gold stem, please. I won't make you swear to it, but there's just so much more to the world than gold stem. A plant that maybe earned Perennial Plant of the Year before people really knew exactly what its problems were. A plant that's notoriously susceptible to septoria. It shocked me about 5 years ago. I'm on the advisory board for White Flower Farm, and so we meet every now and then to kind of review what's in the catalog. In 2015, still after decades, the #1 selling perennial in the White Flower Farm catalog was Gold Stem. And I said the only reason that is because about every 3 years it needs to be replaced because it's died because of septoria. And, it's hard not to love, right? We like it yellow. I mean, it's bold, it's happy, I get it, but my gosh, that we've come so far. Sweet as honey, one of the little ones that we used in that garden, and smaller, really hairy, fuzzy stems, which is a trait to look for in Rudbeckia. The hairier they are, the more likely they are to be resistant to septoria because for whatever reason the fungal spores just can't get to the sort of the contact point on the leaf when they have more ingumentum or more hair. Sweet as honey is quite small, likes drier conditions. Rudbeckia fulgida, just straight bradydemii, which is just a wild occurring form that's not been in any breeders' hands, is suddenly now way more available in the seed trade than it used to be. The nice thing about demii, this is one plant, and it just grows in this kind of perfect dome. No need for PGRs, no need for growth control. It just sort of grows in that kind of nice kind of globe dome-shaped habit, and it flowers for months. So Gold stem is Rudbeckia fulgida, but another variety. So in that species, there's about 5 different naturally occurring varieties. Only one of them is resistant to septoria. And demii happens to be one of those. So a lot of the new varieties of Rudbeckias now are utilizing demii. If you've heard of American Gold Rush, All American Selections winner, and now the Perennial Plant of the Year, you can see that obviously where it gets a little heritage from demii because of that habit. That's in the Chicago Botanic Garden Trial Garden. If you've ever been to CBG and have seen their trial garden, it's not the most pleasant place to grow trial plants because it's nothing but heavy clay there. It's actually one of the worst soils of a trial garden I've ever seen. But that's a good place to trial plants because you're pushing them to an extreme. Rudbeckias and clay are maybe not the first combination you would make in your mind, but American Gold Rush has other things to say about that. So we've begun using it more. The first time I saw it, I was just like, this is so loud. It's just like, wow. But I mean, it's also just wow. I mean, we do a lot of work in places like curb cut, road cuts and landscapes of vehicular scale where we need color to sort of cue people to do things like slow the F down. Or, so plants like this have a way of doing that. It's hard to miss them. They're great parking lot garden plant. And you can see these in a string of former. You can always kind of tell if I've done a parking lot because American Gold Rush will be in there somewhere along the way. It's a signature plant at this point because it is truly traffic stop. So lots to be excited about at Rudbeckias, who knew? Asters, true asters, our native Cynthia trichomes. A lot of options these days. I always tell people, I don't know why we're so obsessed with mums. They're a crop with basically 3 weeks of shelf time in the spring and the fall. Asters, don't look like much in a pot, nor do mums for that matter until a certain point in the fall. But true asters keep coming back year after year after year. They're some of the longest of the perennials that we can plant, so just a much better runway for consumer success. A lot of interesting hybrids and breeding happening. This is a sort of a spontaneous seedling. Long story on it, but we ended up with what we believe were the last plants when I was at the botanical garden that were available in the trade. And it was so good. It's like a purple boxwood. It grows in a perfect dome like this. It's the last plant to be in flower. I've cut it on Thanksgiving Day before. It's incredible. And it's one of the last sort of bastions for pollinators. It's called Lala, and it actually is clonal too, so it spreads slowly, not aggressively, just by little runners, and just keeps forming. It's like it's almost this self-perpetuating hedge. Brent has it now. We've gotten cuttings to other nurseries across the country to try and get this back into the supply chain. It was discovered in a private garden in Nashville many years ago. It was given away to somebody who put a name on it, and it's just kind of been limping along, and it's just truly a really outstanding plant. Blooms later, if you're thinking of like Raven's favorite in October skies, the aromatic asters. This blooms longer and later than both of those, which are great plants too, things considered. Aromatic asters, which is sort of what one parent, we believe, of Lala is, are really great tough plants. Again, for a whole litany of reasons. Range of colors, typically blue. There are pink forms out there as well. Very stress-tolerant plants, good in ground gardens and house strips and curb cuts and all that kind of thing. Asters for wet. We love willow leaf aster for bioswales, pond edges, wet places where you can kind of run around a little bit and poke up between things. It's always nice to have floral resources, not only just for color and human enjoyment, but also for pollinators and the creatures we share our world with who need to eat something all the way through frost. So good to have around like them too. Asters for kind of the edge of shade, zigzag aster here, long blooming plants. I first got turned on to that actually by Neil DeVal up here at Prairie Nursery many years ago, and we started growing it. And it's strange that it's not more common or more available because it's quite good to have around. Ironweeds blooming, just beginning to bloom now for us in Des Moines. This is one of Brent Horvath's called Southern Cross. Jim All, before he retired in Chicago Botanic Garden, had gotten a hold of some breeding work and had taken iron butterfly, which has been in the industry for a while, and tried to get it on a better plant. Iron butterfly, even though it's short, tends to lodge and fall apart, which is kind of ugly. Summer swan song does not do that, so it stays kind of nice and round and tight. Really fine foliage, looks like an Amsonia at a certain point until it starts to flower this time of the year, and flowers really for about a month to 6 weeks through the end of the fall. Goldenrods do not cause hay fever, of course, but many people still love to think that. I still argue with my grandmother about that, but that's all right. They just bloom at the wrong time of the year. They're guilty by association more than anything else. But lots of good goldenrods, all sorts of sizes. There's more to goldenrods than fireworks. Fireworks is great, but if you're in a garden for more than 5 or 6 years, you're going to have a garden of fireworks, and that's going to be it because it gets huge. It just takes up a lot of space. Missouri goldenrod is maybe one of the shortest of the genus. Can tolerate extreme amounts of drought. It's native all the way up through the Rockies into hot, dry cliff slopes. So on the other end of the spectrum, if you need some space and you have a parking lot you need to do with, Solar Cascade is an incredible goldenrod. It spreads clonally, so it does form kind of colonies of itself. kind of spills over curb edges and those sorts of things, nobody's going to cut the curb there because the seed plant, which is sort of precisely why we put it where it did. So a nice one to have around too. And then, what could we say about asters without talking about sunflowers? Lots and lots and lots of good sunflowers out there, but if you had to pick one, the last of them, I'm always trying to see who wins the race till frost. I want color just from the the downbeat of spring all the way to the final draw of frost. And so this is often it's actually usually in flower on the night of frost, and it stays in bloom for probably a week or two after that. This is called First Light, which I always think should be Last Light, but at any rate. First Light narrowleaf sunflower, really fine thread-like foliage, and a good one to have around kind of late in the year. Something to look forward to as the season wraps up. One of the kind of last peak categories here, we'll kind of jump to a close. So talking about verticals, it's something that as we are creating wilder gardens, that people are aware that suddenly everything doesn't live down here, that some things can be up here and can actually have give this garden a sense of architecture and a sense of space. When Better Homes and Gardens calls me for asking for a list of plants that have vertical stems, I start to know that people are interested in things that are not just meatballs in a pot. So Better Homes and Gardens is always a good bellwether of where kind of consumers are at. We're lucky we do a lot of work with them because they're in Des Moines, headquartered in Des Moines. But at any rate, one of the beautiful things, if you have the space, particularly for tall plants, is that they do draw the garden up into space. I'm a tall person. I love seeing plants that are taller than I am, and I'm walking through plants in that way. Again, the caveat that we introduced at the beginning of the talk about small gardens means that small gardens can't always have too many tall herbaceous perennials because on the account of limited space. But there's good reason to want to make good choices about the few maybe that you can. I was first introduced actually in the wild to this plant here in Wisconsin many years ago. It's quite common in wet ditches along through here. This is that photo taken years ago at the Flower Factory over by Madison. Formerly, I should say, but Angelica adropurpurea, purple stem Angelica, tall kind of hazy purple stems, kind of the same variety, although it blooms much later in the season, is Arno glossum, or pale Indian plantains, tall kind of creamy flowers that bloom for weeks, kind of catching the light, sunset like that. Nice coarse texture in the foliage in the rest of the season. A plant I love growing just for the leaves alone. Its flowers aren't much to write home about. But if you have often people do a sump pump or something that takes water away from the house, that sort of burping spot right back in the back corner of the house where water runs out in daylights is always a challenging place to work with, particularly if it's close to the foundation. This is the plant that you can plant right at that little outlet. It likes having wet feet, it gets rather big and bodacious and sort of covers things up. Napea dioica, it's sort of very unknown native of the upper Midwest, but not that hard to find. It's in the trade, all things considered. I always find in the prairie palette it's difficult to find coarse textures. We can find lots of grasses and fine things all day long, but things that have really prominent leaves are not common. It doesn't make a lot of sense in this part of the world where big leaf areas are kind of just a big sink for resources, and it's a consequence as opposed to an asset. So anyway, one to look for too. Plant that seems to be getting a lot of traction these days, giant coneflower, which was actually the plant that was on the opening slide for this section. Again, something I would never garden without. It's only native to east central Texas, but it's hard to clear up to zone 4. I first saw it in Montreal probably 15 years ago and had no idea what it was. It has these almost cabbage-like leaves, but that can be almost blue like a hosta, like Halcyon hosta, and with these tall stems and then these yellow flowers. It's probably the most photographed plant in our garden because I just can't stop taking pictures of it. It's also one of the most asked about, and it's probably the first thing that the goldfinches start to eat before any of the other seed heads are ready. They start picking at them when they're still in bloom. There's something about the seeds of this Rebecca that are very attractive to finches and seed-eating birds like that too. Silphiums in the kind of big yellow and tall category of prairie plants, or prairie-related sorts of plants, prairie dock. Again, natives that are certainly becoming way more available than they ever used to be. Big coarse textures at the bottom and then kind of almost naked stems all the way up into the air. These are great for small gardens because they are very tall, but they don't take up a lot of space in between. Those stems, when they're leafless, have a way of kind of getting by with a lot because they don't block anything. You can still see through them, all things considered. And sunny young flowers on par with that. Last section, as we, just conscious of time, last section here, quickly, things for pollinators outright. It's a question that everybody's being asked and wants to know what the top 10 things they can stock the shelves with to sort of answer those questions. It's hard not to answer it first with what's maybe the poster, the panda bear of pollinator conservation, butterfly milkweed, probably more butterfly milkweed being grown and sold in the industry today than there's been ever, which is a great thing. We need more of it, that said too. Of course, there are many different kinds of milkweeds in many different parts of the country. It's a very diverse genus. It's very useful for monarchs as well as other Lepidoptera. Purple milkweed, one great for having edge between shade and sun. Great color, nice color to see kind of in the middle of June when maybe there aren't so many other things blooming in the garden. It's kind of a little lull between spring and summer. Axonias early in the spring. Great pollinator plant, very tough, great fall color, of course, at the end of it. But an important resource early in the spring. There's a number of selections these days that are varying heights and sizes and shapes. They're almost all blue. Probably the one I'm most keen on, might be a dirty word at an event like this, but it's actually a approved winter variety called Storm Cloud. And we grow plants for everybody. We're just interested in good plants. Remember who comes up with them. So we'll look at anybody's stuff. But Storm Cloud's nice because it's the earliest blooming Axonia probably there is. It's a southern provenance, but it's still as hardy as all the rest of them. It just comes up really early with this dark foliage. It's doing that with the daffodils, so it's a great kind of companion plant in that window. And it gets big, but not nearly as big as some of the older Amsonias that we just grew from wild type seed 20 years ago. These still probably only about 32 inches across, maybe 30 feet tall, all things considered. Always important that we're going to be thinking that for plants for pollinators have to be sort of filling gaps all throughout the season, spring to summer. It can't just be now when we're thinking about kind of the peak of the growing season. The little pussy toes, the native ground covers, these little white flowers are not much to look at, but the foliage is what's key for the things like the American lady butterfly, painted lady butterfly, that often starts its life cycle very early in the spring. Those caterpillars need something to munch on. Great ground cover, fills in, takes shade from the edges of other plants. Again, a nice companion for that daffodil moment of the season when it's nice to have something else going. If you go to old cemeteries in the end of April and the first part of May, you'll see sheets of these things. They actually are quite good at outcompeting even grass because they're kind of like walnuts and they have an alleliopathic trait to them, so they tend to exclude other plants from growing around them, which is always a good thing for a ground cover because that's what they're supposed to be doing, is closing off the ground and keeping other weeds out. So nice plant to have around in the understory. A plant that's native that nobody seems to know about, but that is just one of the maybe the more asked about things at the moment. It blooms in May, just before penstemon season, when penstemon steals the show, is Erythrin pulchellus, a selection called Lynn Hagel's Carpet, which you can get from North Creek Nursery and now a few other places. It's not patented, but it is around. Vigorous ground cover forms these just almost little cupcake-looking sets of leaves, but then give rise to all these cheery little daisy flowers in May. Easy, great to have around. Blue-eyed grass, terrifically good in containers. I saw it actually. We stopped by Lowe's to pick up some construction stuff this spring, and they had an end cap full of them, and I just bought them all because they were 1 gallon pots and fully in bloom, and I just stuffed all of our spring containers along with the tulips with them. It was incredible. I could buy this plant wholesale, but I impulsively just bought it at that moment. It was a great color sale positioning. Whoever did the display got points for whatever they were doing. And they flower for a good long time. Those containers, we just tore them out of the containers probably about a month ago, actually, just to switch them over for something else. And then we popped them into the garden because, of course, they're quite perennial. But for people who only can grow in containers and need perennials that are small enough that fit the bill, but they keep blooming like that, it's not something I would have put on the list if you'd asked me before this, but a great example of something like that. A lot of work in bee balms these days, but I still tell you the native Monarda branderiana is still the best one. It's been used a lot in breeding. There's a lot of good selections. I would say there are relatively few great new selections. I'm always going to go back to the wild type in this instance when I can. A lot of diversity, even in just colors and shapes of flowers like that too. New yarrow from Walter's Gardens. I've been very down on most yarrows for kind of my whole life, I guess. But other than the native white form, which is again not that pretty, but it's fine. It's just not that interesting, but it's like fine to have around. My tune has changed because this is a series called the Sassy Summer Series, and it has really sort of changed my tune about these things. The color is really nice, but the duration of the flowering is what's incredible. The flowers hold for weeks and weeks and weeks. And even once the color is faded, this is at the beginning of the display. I should have put in. I took a photo of this the other day. I should have layered it in behind it. Even when these fade, so to speak, it's still a really nice kind of soft pink color, and it just sits there and holds in the garden for just half of the summer practically. You get the bare root from Walters, finish them off, and they'll be flowering 8 weeks later. It's kind of incredible. So my tune's changed about that. Flowering yesterday when I was leaving the house. Our native naughty onions, a whole lot of those available these days. We can't also forget too, the last point I'll make about these things is making sure that we've got floral resources that carry us all the way through the season. We want to enjoy plants all the way through the season, so does the life that we share our garden with too. So with that, I'm a little over time, but I'll encourage you to sign up on the website for the newsletter, stay in touch. Didn't bring copies of New Naturalism, which is my latest book today, but you can order send copies from us at the shop online, and we'll be happy to have, I think there's nothing in here right after this, but I would love to answer the questions you have of any plants talk today. Thank you for